As you drift off to sleep tonight, we'll tell the story of one of the most fascinating people. If our stories help you relax and fall asleep, please subscribe. It would mean the world to us. And now, as you continue to relax, let's begin. Tonight's story is about Conor McGregor. The house had finally become quiet. Not the kind of quiet that arrives naturally, but the strange silence that only appears after years of noise. Somewhere far beyond the tall glass windows, the city still moved faintly in the dark, headlights drifting across wet roads, distant engines dissolving into the night air. But inside the mansion, the movement had slowed almost completely. A long hallway remained dim except for a single light near the staircase. A pair of training shoes rested near the entrance to a private gym. On a polished counter nearby, 2 watches reflected a thin line of moonlight without moving at all. And somewhere deeper in the house, long after midnight, Conor McGregor was still awake, not performing, not speaking into microphones, not standing beneath arena lights while thousands of people shouted his name into the ceiling of a packed stadium. The suits were gone. The cameras were gone. Even the confidence that once seemed to follow him everywhere had nowhere particular to go tonight. There was only a man moving slowly through rooms large enough to echo softly when he walked across them alone. People often imagine fame as permanent noise, but noise cannot survive every hour of the night. Eventually the crowd leaves. Eventually the interviews end. Eventually the private jets land somewhere far from the arenas, where strangers once waited outside for hours just to see a glimpse of someone they believed larger than ordinary life. And after enough years, a strange contrast begins to appear between public identity and private stillness. The louder the world becomes around a person, the more noticeable the silence feels when it finally arrives. Perhaps that was why the house itself felt almost observant tonight. The marble floors carried soft reflections from low lights near the walls. Expensive artwork remained motionless in the dark. Somewhere upstairs, distant air conditioning hummed quietly through long corridors lined with framed photographs from another version of life. Championship moments, tailored suits, crowded press conferences, victory celebrations frozen permanently behind glass. Images captured during moments that once felt enormous now rested silently in the background, like artifacts from another climate. A fighter's life often appears simple from the outside. People see impact, movement, violence compressed into short moments under bright lights. They see confidence delivered sharply into microphones before fights. They hear predictions spoken with certainty. They remember knockouts, entrances, headlines, and celebrations. But the larger portion of that life happens elsewhere, in silence, in repetition, in recovery rooms and empty gyms and hotel suites where sleep refuses to arrive before competition. Those moments rarely appear in public memory, and yet they may shape a person more than the arenas ever could. Tonight, somewhere within the quiet architecture of the house, the rhythm of that unseen life still lingered. A heavy bag hung untouched in the private gym downstairs. Hand wraps remained folded near a bench exactly where they had been left earlier in the evening. A television screen rested black against the wall. The room smelled faintly of leather, disinfectant and effort. The familiar scent of preparation repeated over thousands of hours. For many years, preparation had been the centre of everything. Long before wealth arrived, before tailored suits and expensive watches and crowded stages, before private security escorted him through hotel lobbies while cameras flashed endlessly from every direction, before his name travelled far beyond Ireland, there had simply been training, movement, discipline repeated quietly while most of the world remained unaware that anything important was happening at all. In some ways, those years never completely disappear from a fighter, even after success changes the visible shape of life, because effort leaves traces behind, not only in the body, but in the mind's rhythm. Waking early without alarms, measuring time through preparation, feeling strangely restless during stillness, carrying tension inside silence because the body spent too many years expecting conflict at any moment. The kitchen lights remained low as he moved through the room slowly. Outside the windows, rain touched the glass in irregular patterns. Ireland had taught him that sound long ago. Rain against windows, wind against buildings, grey skies stretching endlessly above neighbourhoods where ambition often stayed hidden beneath ordinary routines. Long before luxury entered his life, weather had been one of the few constant things. Dublin existed differently in memory at night. Not as the city tourists imagined during crowded afternoons, but as narrow streets under cold air, buses moving through early morning darkness, small apartments lit dimly before dawn while people prepared for another difficult day. Before the suits and championships and global recognition, there had been small rooms and uncertain direction. There had been construction work, welfare payments, conversations about practicality and stability. The ordinary pressure of growing older while still chasing something invisible. The world usually meets successful people after the uncertainty has already ended. But uncertainty is often where the real story lives. Years earlier, before interviews became polished performances, there had been mornings when Conor McGregor travelled to training sessions without guarantees that any of it would lead anywhere meaningful. The gyms were smaller then, the equipment older. Sometimes the rooms felt too cold during winter mornings before enough bodies arrived to warm the air. Fighters stretched quietly against walls while coaches prepared pads nearby. Gloves scraped softly against canvas. Water bottles rolled across floors between rounds. No audience existed there, only effort. An effort can feel strangely invisible while it's happening, especially during the early years when nobody outside a small circle believes anything extraordinary is taking shape. The young fighter who entered those gyms carried confidence already, but confidence alone does not remove exhaustion. It does not soften bruises or shorten recovery time. It does not make uncertainty disappear during long nights when the future still looks unfinished. Behind the sharp predictions and rising ambition existed the slower reality of repetition. Endless drills, controlled breathing. Soreness carried home quietly after training sessions ended. There are moments in every ambitious life when progress becomes almost impossible to measure. A person continues moving forward without visible proof that the movement matters. Perhaps those years shaped him more deeply than victory ever could. Because obscurity forces people into direct conversation with themselves. Without applause, motivation must survive privately. Without recognition, discipline becomes personal rather than performative. And somewhere within those ordinary years in Ireland, while buses moved through rainy streets outside and most of the world remained unaware of his name, something steady began forming beneath the surface. Not merely confidence, conviction. The difference between the two becomes clearer with time. Confidence often wants witnesses. Conviction can survive alone. The gym downstairs remained untouched as the night deepened around the house. A digital clock near the wall glowed softly above the equipment. The room itself felt suspended between two versions of life. The disciplined simplicity of a fighter's routine and the overwhelming luxury success eventually built around it. Large windows overlooked darkness beyond the property. Recovery machines rested silently near the far wall. Rows of neatly arranged weights reflected small fragments of light. Success changes environments quickly, sometimes faster than the mind fully adapts to them. And yet certain habits remain strangely permanent. Even now, years removed from those smaller gyms in Dublin, traces of the old rhythms still appeared in the structure of everyday life. Training schedules, physical maintenance, controlled eating, recovery routines, long periods of focus invisible to the public. Because fighting, unlike many professions, never fully allows the body to forget what it once endured. The body remembers impact long after crowds stop talking about it. Perhaps that is why fighters often appear most thoughtful during stillness. The world sees aggression under bright lights, but rarely notices the quieter calculations afterward. Ice baths after injuries. Slow walks through hallways while joints recover. Sitting awake late at night because adrenaline once trained the nervous system to remain alert even after danger has passed. These moments belong to a hidden side of combat sports rarely discussed openly, and yet they may reveal more about a fighter than the fights themselves. Upstairs, another room remained softly illuminated. Shelves lined the walls beside framed memorabilia collected over years that changed not only his career, but the entire scale of his public existence. Championship belts, promotional photographs, luxury items gathered from different countries and different chapters of fame. To outsiders, such rooms often appear like proof of arrival, evidence that the difficult years have been conquered permanently. But objects cannot fully explain a life, especially a life built around performance. Because performance creates distance over time, the public begins recognizing a version of someone carefully sharpened beneath attention. A persona grows louder, interviews become expectations, confidence evolves into mythology, and eventually the person underneath must continue existing quietly beside the image everyone else prefers to see. For Conor McGregor, confidence became almost architectural. Press conferences transformed into stages of psychological control, sharp suits, relaxed posture, direct eye contact, predictions delivered without hesitation. He understood spectacle better than most fighters of his generation, not merely violence inside the cage, but narrative outside it. Audiences leaned towards certainty, and he learned how to speak with absolute certainty even before outcomes existed. The world rewarded that skill quickly. Attention gathered around him faster each year. Arenas expanded, cameras multiplied, headlines travelled internationally. Suddenly the fighter from Dublin no longer belonged only to small gyms and local conversations. He had become global entertainment. Millions watched entrances before fights even began. Journalists studied every sentence. Luxury brands noticed him. Crowds reacted before he even entered rooms. But attention changes the atmosphere around ordinary life. Privacy becomes fragmented. Silence becomes difficult to protect. And somewhere beneath all the noise, the original person must continue waking each morning inside a body still vulnerable to exhaustion, doubt, injury, and time. That contradiction followed many famous athletes through history. The public sees symbols, the individual still experiences ordinary human nights. Perhaps tonight was one of those nights. The rain outside had slowed almost completely now. Only occasional droplets touched the windows while the house settled deeper into silence. In another room, a television screen displayed paused footage from an old fight. Frozen movement suspended permanently mid-action. One glove extended forward. One step unfinished. A moment that once existed at impossible speed, now held completely still beneath dim light. Stillness changes things. It allows details to surface that noise usually hides. Fighters understand this differently than most people. Their profession depends upon moments so intense that ordinary awareness temporarily disappears inside them. During competition, thought narrows. Time behaves strangely. The body reacts before conscious reflection fully forms. But afterward, when recovery begins and silence returns, memory slowly expands around those moments again, sometimes gently, sometimes heavily. There are nights when even victory feels strangely quiet afterward. Hotel rooms after major fights often become unexpectedly still once teams and reporters finally leave. Ice packs melt slowly. Adrenaline fades unevenly. Bruises begin forming beneath the skin. Outside the windows, entire cities continue celebrating, while the fighter sits alone inside exhausted silence, unable to fully rest yet. Perhaps fame exaggerates that contrast. The higher the noise climbs publicly, the deeper the silence can feel privately afterward. And over enough years, a person may begin wondering where one version of themselves ends and another begins. The young man from Dublin gyms, the champion beneath arena lights, the global celebrity, the businessman, the father, the fighter recovering quietly in the dark after everyone else has gone home. All of them real, yet none existing completely separate from the others. The hallway lights dimmed automatically as the hour grew later. Somewhere beyond the glass, dawn still remained far away. The house continued resting in near silence, carrying the atmosphere of a life that had travelled an enormous distance without ever fully escaping the quieter questions waiting beneath success. Questions that rarely appear during interviews, questions that often arrive only after midnight. And tonight, in the enormous stillness surrounding him, Those questions seemed closer than the noise ever had. The mornings in Dublin had a particular kind of cold. Not dramatic cold, not the sharp violence of deep winter storms. It was quieter than that. A damp heaviness that settled into bus windows, apartment walls, and the sleeves of jackets worn too many times through the rain. The streets often looked half awake before sunrise, as if the city itself needed time to gather enough energy to begin another day. Delivery trucks moved slowly through narrow roads. Early workers waited silently at bus stops with shoulders slightly raised against the wind. Somewhere in the distance, gulls circled above the river, while grey clouds pressed low across the sky. Long before the world knew the name Conor McGregor, he belonged to those mornings, not as a celebrity, not as a champion, just another young man moving through an ordinary city carrying ambitions that sounded unrealistic to most people around him. The future had not revealed itself yet. There were no championship belts resting behind glass, no interviews waiting, no crowds chanting his name, only uncertainty, discipline, and the strange persistence required to continue believing in something invisible. In those years, life still moved close to the ground. Construction work came and went. Money remained limited. Conversations about stability followed him quietly through family rooms and neighbourhood streets. Practicality surrounded almost every part of ordinary Irish life then. Secure work mattered. Reliable income mattered. Dreaming too loudly about becoming globally famous through fighting could sound less like ambition and more like escape from reality. But certain people continue moving toward distant ideas even when the environment around them cannot fully see what they see. Perhaps that was already true about him early on. There were mornings when he travelled to training while much of the city remained asleep. The buses carried tired workers through dim streets, while condensation gathered against the windows. Headphones blocked out the noise of engines and conversation. Outside, shop shutters remained closed beneath pale morning light. Inside his mind, however, another world was already forming. Not clearly yet, but enough to create momentum. The gym did not look impressive in those days. No luxury equipment, no polished architecture, no cinematic lighting designed for cameras, just worn mats, old bags, heavy breathing, and the constant sound of effort repeating itself hour after hour. Fighters stretched quietly against the walls before training began. Gloves hit pads in steady rhythms. Coaches moved between athletes correcting small details invisible to outsiders. The room smelled faintly of sweat, disinfectant, damp clothing, and exhaustion. A real gym always does. And inside those rooms, status means very little. Talent matters, yes. Confidence matters too. But consistency matters more than almost anything. The body cannot be persuaded through personality alone. It responds only to repetition. A fighter either returns tomorrow or disappears slowly over time. There is very little space between those outcomes. Young fighters learn this quickly, especially the ones chasing futures nobody else fully understands. Some mornings the body already hurt before training even started. Bruised ribs, tight shoulders, soreness buried deep in the legs from previous sessions. But stopping was dangerous in another way. Momentum could disappear. Discipline could weaken. And somewhere in the back of every ambitious fighter's mind existed the quiet fear that someone else, somewhere else might be working harder at that exact moment. Competition begins long before the cage door closes. Sometimes it begins alone in silence before sunrise. There were periods during those early years when his life existed almost entirely between training sessions. Cardio, sparring, recovery, repetition. The rhythm became physical, almost mechanical. Days blurred together through effort. One session ended, another began. The body adapted slowly. Confidence sharpened gradually through small improvements invisible to the outside world. And yet beyond the gym, ordinary life continued pressing inward. Bills still existed. Expectations still existed. Friends moved into more stable jobs and predictable routines, while fighting remained uncertain. Success in combat sports is never guaranteed. Thousands of talented athletes disappear before reaching recognition. Injuries interrupt careers. Momentum vanishes suddenly. Opportunities fail to arrive. The future remains unstable for much longer than most people realize. Perhaps that instability creates a particular emotional atmosphere around fighters during their early years, a strange combination of belief and isolation. Because belief becomes necessary when evidence has not arrived yet. At night, after training ended and the city settled into darkness again, there were quieter moments when ambition likely felt heavier than exciting. Sitting inside small apartments while muscles ached from sparring, listening to rain touch the windows, watching ordinary life continue around him while carrying the private conviction that his own life might eventually become something very different. That kind of conviction can feel lonely, especially before success gives other people permission to believe in it too. The world often supports ambition only after ambition succeeds. Before that, people become cautious, concerned, skeptical, sometimes even protective. Parents worry, friends question practicality, conversations drift towards safer directions. A stable trade, reliable income, predictable structure, these are reasonable concerns in places where survival itself requires discipline. And Dublin understood discipline. The city carried generations of working people who measured life carefully through effort and endurance. Pride existed there, but rarely in loud forms. Humour covered hardship. Resilience hid itself beneath ordinary routines. Young men grew up surrounded by stories of labour, struggle, and persistence. Perhaps that atmosphere shaped him more deeply than fame later did. Because beneath the spectacle that the world eventually came to know, there remained traces of something older and simpler. A person accustomed to pushing through difficult conditions quietly. The training sessions grew more intense over time. Movement sharpened. Timing improved. Confidence became more visible. Coaches noticed things others had not yet seen. Sparring rounds changed character once skill began matching ambition more consistently. The young fighter entering the gym no longer felt merely hopeful. He began carrying himself like someone expecting the future to arrive eventually. Not hoping, expecting. That difference changes posture, voice, presence, even before success becomes public. Some fighters move nervously through gyms during their early years. Others remain silent and uncertain. But he already seemed connected to a larger internal image of himself. Not arrogance, exactly. Something more specific than that. A belief so constant it almost became physical. And yet confidence alone never protected fighters from exhaustion. There were still long nights after brutal sessions when the body felt nearly empty. Ice pressed against bruises. Hands remained swollen from impact. Recovery became its own quiet ritual. Stretching in silence. Slow breathing. Waiting for soreness to soften enough to begin again tomorrow. No cameras existed during those moments. Nobody applauded recovery. But recovery may reveal more about a fighter than aggression ever could. Because fighting itself occupies only brief stretches of time. The larger reality involves preparation and repair, damage and rebuilding, endless cycles repeated through years while ordinary life continues outside the gym walls, completely unaware of what the body is enduring internally. In small ways, those years began separating him from the version of life many people around him expected him to live. Friends continued through ordinary routines while he disappeared deeper into training culture. The structure of his days became increasingly different from the structure of normal life. Sleep schedules changed. Eating habits changed. Priorities narrowed. Social life often adjusted itself around preparation. The world slowly becomes smaller when someone commits fully to competition. Not emotionally smaller, perhaps, but more focused, more deliberate. Certain distractions begin fading naturally because the body itself demands attention. Fighters cannot entirely escape themselves. Weakness appears immediately in training. Poor discipline reveals itself physically. Fatigue exposes everything eventually. Inside gyms, reality tends to surface quickly, and reality shaped him constantly during those years. The mythological version of Conor McGregor had not formed yet. There was no global persona filling press conferences with calculated confidence. only a young Irish fighter still building himself through ordinary repetition. But perhaps the roots of that future personality already existed quietly beneath the surface. Because performance often begins as protection. A fighter entering dangerous situations repeatedly cannot always afford visible hesitation. Confidence becomes armor long before it becomes entertainment. Speaking certainty aloud can stabilize the mind against fear. Predicting victory can create psychological structure around uncertainty. Over enough time, those behaviors stop feeling temporary. They become identity, or something very close to identity. Outside the gym, Dublin nights continued moving beneath rain and streetlights. Pubs filled with conversation and music, taxi lights drifted through wet streets, apartment windows glowed softly above narrow roads. Somewhere inside that ordinary city atmosphere, the future global superstar still moved mostly unnoticed. He trained, he recovered. He visualized another life repeatedly, until the vision itself began feeling tangible. Perhaps ambition always requires a degree of isolation at first, not because people intentionally withdraw from others, but because the future they see has not yet become visible to anyone else. And invisibility changes the emotional texture of daily life. A person begins carrying two realities simultaneously, the ordinary present and the imagined future quietly pulling them forward. Sometimes those realities feel connected, sometimes they feel impossibly far apart. There were likely nights when exhaustion made everything seem uncertain again. Every ambitious life contains those moments. Walking home after difficult sessions beneath cold air, while wondering how long the struggle can realistically continue. Listening to ordinary city sounds while privately negotiating with doubt. Because doubt never fully disappears. Even the most confident people often build their confidence in direct response to doubt itself. The public eventually came to know him as someone almost impossibly self-assured. Sharp predictions, direct eye contact, unshaken posture beneath pressure. But human beings rarely emerge fully formed into the world. Confidence evolves gradually through repetition, survival, adaptation, and necessity. And necessity shaped much of those early years. Not luxury, not comfort, necessity. The necessity to continue moving forward before evidence existed. The necessity to train while uncertain whether success would arrive. The necessity to protect belief privately until reality finally caught up to it. Late at night now, years removed from those smaller Dublin gyms, traces of that younger life still seem to linger quietly beneath everything wealth had added later. Because memory does not disappear simply because circumstances improve. The body remembers old routines, the mind remembers uncertainty. Even luxury can sometimes feel strangely temporary to people who spent enough years surviving without it. Perhaps that was why silence carried such weight now. Inside enormous houses and expensive rooms, a person may still hear echoes from earlier versions of life. The sound of gloves against worn pads, rain against apartment windows, breathing heavily after sparring rounds, walking through Dublin streets while imagining a future no one else could fully see yet. Those memories remain alive in ways photographs cannot capture, especially during quiet hours, especially after midnight. And somewhere beneath the polished image the world eventually came to recognize, the younger fighter from Ireland still seemed present somehow, still moving through cold mornings toward gyms before sunrise, still carrying invisible conviction through ordinary streets, still believing that one day the noise of the world would finally reach him. By the time the rest of the world began noticing Conor McGregor, the rhythm had already been established. People often mistake sudden visibility for sudden transformation. A fighter appears on television, delivers a sharp interview, wins convincingly, and audiences assume the story began there. But public discovery usually happens long after private construction. Years of unnoticed effort stand silently behind moments that later appear inevitable, and inevitability became part of his presence very early, even before championships arrived. There was something unusual about the way he entered rooms during those years. Coaches noticed it. Fighters noticed it. Reporters eventually noticed it too. Not simply confidence. Combat sports are already filled with confident people. This felt more deliberate than ordinary self-belief. He moved as though he had already spent years mentally rehearsing a future everyone else was only beginning to witness for the first time. The smaller venues came first. Regional promotions. Crowds compact enough that individual voices could still be heard during fights. Bright overhead lights hanging above modest cages. Security guards standing near narrow walkways while music echoed through local arenas. The atmosphere felt raw then, closer, less polished than the global spectacle that would follow later. Backstage rooms carried their own quiet tension, tape wrapped slowly around wrists and hands. Coaches spoke in controlled tones nearby. Water bottles rested beside folding chairs. Some fighters paced nervously while others stared silently at the floor, trying to settle their breathing. The air often smelled faintly of sweat, athletic tape, disinfectant, and adrenaline beginning to rise beneath the skin. Those moments before competition rarely appear clearly in public memory, but they may be among the most honest moments in sports, because eventually the crowd disappears from awareness, cameras stop mattering, personas become less important. A fighter sits alone with anticipation moving steadily through the body while waiting for a cage door to open. No prediction can fully remove that reality. No confidence eliminates physical risk entirely. The body always understands danger, even when the mind attempts to rise above it. Perhaps that was part of what made him compelling early on. He did not merely appear fearless. He appeared unusually calm beside fear itself, as though nervous energy had been reorganized into something more useful, more focused. While other fighters sometimes seemed burdened by pressure, he often looked sharpened by it. Pressure can reveal people slowly. Some collapse inward beneath expectation. Others become clearer. The walk toward the cage eventually became one of the most recognizable images in combat sports. But during those earlier nights, the entrances remained simpler. Dim hallways, small crowds leaning over barriers, music vibrating through narrow arenas while local commentators spoke rapidly into headsets nearby. Yet even then, there was already a certain stillness in his movement before fights. Not slow exactly, controlled. As though he preferred conserving emotional energy while chaos gathered around him. And perhaps that control became addictive over time. Fighting itself is unpredictable. One mistake changes everything. One moment of hesitation, one unseen strike, one injury arriving instantly beneath bright lights. Inside that uncertainty, fighters searched desperately for anything stable enough to hold on to mentally. Routine, breathing, confidence, rituals repeated so many times they begin calming the nervous system automatically. For him, certainty itself became ritual. Predictions spoken publicly before fights. Precise outcomes described calmly into microphones. Statements delivered with such conviction that audiences gradually stopped hearing them as possibilities and began hearing them as glimpses into an outcome already decided somewhere privately beforehand. The media loved this version of him quickly. Combat sports had always depended partly on personality, but his approach felt different from ordinary promotion. There was rhythm in the way he spoke, timing, humour mixed beside aggression, precision mixed beside spectacle. Press conferences transformed around his presence. Silence disappeared once he entered rooms, attention moved toward him naturally, and attention changes people in ways that often remain invisible at first. During those years, fame still existed mostly at the edges of life rather than completely surrounding it. Recognition appeared gradually. More interviews, larger audiences, fans waiting longer outside arenas, strangers beginning to repeat his own phrases back toward him. The public version of Conor McGregor slowly expanded beyond the private individual who had spent years training quietly in Dublin gyms. That transition can feel strange for anyone. but especially for fighters, because combat sports create intimacy between public image and physical identity. The audience does not simply watch performances. They watch bodies endure damage. They watch exhaustion. They watch confidence survive or collapse under pressure in real time. Over enough years, the separation between performer and person can begin feeling dangerously thin. Perhaps that was why the quieter moments remained important. Even during the rise, hotel rooms after fights still became silent eventually, no matter how loud arenas had been earlier, no matter how many interviews followed victories. At some point the doors closed, the team left, and the fighter remained alone with adrenaline still moving unevenly through the body. Those nights rarely end quickly. The nervous system stays awake long after competition finishes. Muscles remain tight. Bruises begin surfacing beneath the skin. Ice presses against swelling, while television screens replay moments that already feel strangely distant despite occurring only hours earlier. Outside the windows, entire cities continue celebrating. Inside the room, silence returns slowly. Perhaps fighters become accustomed to existing between those two worlds. Public intensity, private stillness. One cannot fully survive without the other. As the victories continued, the environments around him changed rapidly. Arenas grew larger. Lighting became more cinematic. Production teams multiplied. Media obligations expanded across continents. Suddenly, the young fighter who once moved anonymously through Dublin streets now entered buildings through private entrances while security managed crowds outside. Luxury began appearing gradually at first. Tailored clothing, better hotels, business opportunities, expensive watches resting beneath bright camera flashes. The visual language of success attached itself naturally to him because he understood performance instinctively. He knew how images worked. He understood that modern fame extended beyond competition itself into atmosphere, presentation, narrative. And narrative became one of his greatest skills. People did not simply watch him fight. They watched the story surrounding him, the confidence, the predictions, the rise from Ireland into global attention, the sense that he was constructing something larger than victories alone. In many ways, he was. But constructing public mythology requires energy few people fully understand from the outside. Every appearance begins carrying expectations. Every interview must sustain momentum. Every silence becomes analysed. The world starts looking toward a person not merely for performance, but for continuation of the character audiences believe they know. And maintaining any character continuously can become exhausting over time, especially one built around absolute confidence. Because human beings are rarely absolute internally. Even highly driven people experience uncertainty privately, fatigue privately, reflection privately. The difference is that most people experience those moments away from global scrutiny. Famous athletes often experience them while millions continue projecting expectations onto them daily. Late at night, those expectations can feel strangely distant, almost unreal. Inside hotel suites after major victories, there were likely moments when the noise of fame faded enough for ordinary exhaustion to surface again. Sitting quietly while city lights flickered beyond tall windows, hands bruised, shoulders aching, mind still moving too quickly for sleep, looking around expensive rooms that would have seemed impossible years earlier, while somehow still feeling connected to the younger version of himself from Dublin. Success changes external conditions faster than internal memory. The body adapts slowly to new realities. Perhaps that explains why many fighters continue training with almost obsessive consistency, even after wealth removes practical necessity. The routine itself becomes stabilizing, familiar. A connection back toward earlier identity before fame complicated everything. Inside training environments, reality remains direct. A punch still lands, fatigue still matters, discipline still reveals itself honestly. No amount of money changes those truths. And during those rising years, training likely remained one of the few places where public image dissolved temporarily beneath physical effort again. Sweat equalizes people. Exhaustion strips performance down towards something more honest. Inside gyms, the body refuses illusion eventually. Maybe that honesty became comforting. Because outside the gym, the world around him grew increasingly artificial. Cameras, headlines, social media reactions arriving instantly from millions of strangers, public arguments expanding endlessly online. Fame creates strange distortions around ordinary life. Conversations become recorded content. Mistakes become permanent headlines. Every visible moment begins carrying consequence. Silence becomes harder to find. Privacy becomes more valuable. And yet paradoxically, fame also isolates people from ordinary connection in subtle ways. The more recognizable someone becomes publicly, the more difficult it can feel to know when interactions remain genuine privately. Admiration changes conversations. Attention changes relationships. Entire rooms shift behavior once celebrity enters them. Over enough years, a person may begin craving spaces where nobody expects performance anymore. Perhaps that was part of why the quieter hours mattered so much. Driving late at night after events ended, sitting alone before sunrise while cities remained mostly asleep, walking through large houses after everyone else had gone to bed. These moments allowed the nervous system to return gradually towards something closer to ordinary awareness again, or perhaps as close as possible. Because once a life expands into global attention, ordinary awareness itself changes permanently. The younger fighter from Dublin could still disappear anonymously into city streets. The internationally famous Conor McGregor no longer moved through the world in quite the same way. That loss often arrives quietly beneath success. Privacy shrinking slowly year after year until even silence begins feeling observed somehow. And still, despite all the attention surrounding him during those rising years, certain images continued appearing repeatedly behind the spectacle. A fighter, alone in training rooms after others leave, hand wraps resting beside benches, cold air outside arena exits long after crowds disappear. Early morning recovery sessions while cities remain dark. Moments where confidence softens slightly into thoughtfulness once nobody else remains nearby. Those quieter images perhaps revealed something essential beneath the performance. Not weakness, not uncertainty exactly. Something more human than either. Because eventually every public figure returns to silence at the end of the night. The suits are removed. The interviews stop. The crowds vanish into darkness beyond hotel windows. And somewhere underneath the noise of fame, a person still sits awake alone, listening to the quieter parts of their own life continue breathing beneath everything the world thinks it sees. The larger the arenas became, the stranger the silence afterward often felt. At first, success had arrived in recognizable pieces. A victory, a headline, a growing audience. But eventually the rise accelerated into something far more consuming. The scale changed. Suddenly the walkouts were no longer happening inside modest venues beneath regional lights. Entire stadiums vibrated with sound before Conor McGregor even appeared from backstage corridors. The noise carried weight now, thousands of voices merging together beneath darkness and light. Camera flashes scattering through crowds like distant storms, music swelling through enormous speakers, while screens overhead magnified every movement. The atmosphere before major fights no longer resembled ordinary sporting events. It felt theatrical, mythic almost. A carefully constructed collision between combat and spectacle, and at the centre of it all he often appeared remarkably composed, perhaps too composed. The cameras loved his stillness during those moments. Chin raised slightly, shoulders relaxed, eyes focused somewhere beyond the immediate chaos around him. While audiences shouted and commentators elevated the drama further, he often moved with the controlled rhythm of someone entering a familiar environment, rather than an unpredictable confrontation. But the human nervous system always keeps score eventually, no matter how calm a person appears externally. There were nights before major fights when hotel rooms remained illuminated long after midnight, curtains partially open against distant city lights, expensive suits hanging neatly beside walls. Team members finally gone after long hours of preparation, strategy, interviews and media obligations. The silence afterward probably arrived heavily then. Not peaceful silence, anticipatory silence. The kind that settles around moments capable of altering entire careers. Combat sports magnify pressure in unusually direct ways. A musician may perform poorly and return weeks later for another concert. An actor may fail gradually across projects. But fighters walk alone into compressed moments where outcomes become immediate and public. Victory transforms everything. Defeat does too, and the body understands that reality long before the mind fully processes it. Perhaps that was why preparation became almost sacred during those years. Routine creates stability against uncertainty. The same warm-ups, the same wraps around the hands, the same breathing patterns repeated before entrances. Coaches speaking in familiar tones nearby while adrenaline rises beneath the skin. These rituals matter because they create continuity inside situations designed around chaos. The public usually sees confidence as personality, but often it functions more like architecture, a structure built carefully enough to hold pressure without collapsing inward. And pressure surrounded him constantly by then. Press conferences transformed into psychological battlegrounds weeks before fights even occurred. Reporters packed tightly into crowded rooms waiting for sharp statements and confrontations. Flashbulbs exploded across stages. Opponents attempted mind games. Audiences demanded entertainment before any punches were thrown at all. Most fighters tolerated media obligations. He weaponized them. Words became extensions of combat itself. Precision mattered. Timing mattered. Silence sometimes mattered even more. He understood instinctively how tension could be created through rhythm and certainty. Audiences leaned toward confidence naturally, especially when delivered without hesitation. Over time, the public version of Conor McGregor grew larger than ordinary athletic fame. He became atmosphere, an event before the event. People watched interviews not merely for information but for performance. Every sentence carried potential headlines. Every stare down became content shared globally within minutes. The modern machinery of attention attached itself fully to him because he knew how to feed it constantly without appearing overwhelmed by it, at least publicly. But constant visibility changes the emotional texture of life. Privacy begins dissolving slowly around the edges first. A dinner interrupted, a hotel lobby filling unexpectedly, phones lifted everywhere in public spaces, small moments disappearing beneath documentation. Over enough time, a person may begin performing unconsciously even during ordinary interactions simply because observation never fully stops anymore. That kind of existence can create strange exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion exactly, something quieter. The exhaustion of always remaining visible. Late at night, after the interviews ended and social media noise faded temporarily into the background, there were likely moments when the performance finally loosened slightly around the edges, sitting alone while city lights reflected against glass windows, listening to distant traffic below luxury hotel suites, feeling the body tense with anticipation, while the mind searched for calm somewhere beneath the endless movement of thought. Those hours before major fights rarely belong entirely to sleep. Too much energy remains active inside the body, too many possibilities waiting ahead. And perhaps somewhere beneath all the public confidence existed the quieter awareness that fighting itself always carries risk, no matter how famous someone becomes. Skill reduces danger, preparation reduces danger. But no fighter ever completely controls outcomes once the cage door closes. One mistake changes everything. 1 second alters memory permanently. That knowledge never disappears completely. Maybe that was part of why the quieter rituals became increasingly important as fame expanded. Walking alone through empty hotel hallways before sunrise, stretching silently while the city outside still slept, looking out windows from high floors where streets below appeared distant and unreal beneath early morning fog. These small moments grounded reality again, because fame itself can become strangely disorienting over time. The world starts responding more to image than person. Crowds project ideas onto public figures until the individual underneath sometimes feels hidden beneath layers of expectation. People no longer meet you neutrally. They meet the reputation first, and reputations eventually begin speaking louder than ordinary human presence. For him, the reputation centered around certainty, not cautious confidence, absolute confidence. Predictions spoken with calm precision before globally watched fights. assurances delivered so directly that even opponents occasionally seemed psychologically affected before competition began. The public loved this version of him because certainty feels comforting to audiences, especially inside sports built around violence and unpredictability. But human beings themselves are rarely built entirely from certainty. Even highly disciplined minds contain quieter rooms where doubt occasionally moves through unnoticed. Not catastrophic doubt, perhaps. More subtle than that. Questions arriving briefly during sleepless hours. Thoughts surfacing between adrenaline and exhaustion. Wondering how long the body can continue enduring pressure at elite levels. Wondering whether identity itself has become too connected to performance. These questions rarely appear during press conferences, but silence invites them naturally. There were likely nights after enormous victories when celebration continued loudly outside while he remained unexpectedly thoughtful inside hotel suites above the city, championship belts resting nearby beneath soft lighting, bruises slowly darkening beneath the skin, television screens replaying triumphant moments that already felt strangely distant despite occurring only hours earlier. Victory itself can feel surreal immediately afterward, especially when imagined for years beforehand. The world sees completion in those moments. But fighters often experience something more complicated. Relief, exhaustion, emptiness, adrenaline fading unevenly while the nervous system struggles to understand that danger has ended for now. Perhaps that emotional contrast deepened as fame grew larger. The public celebrations expanded. The financial rewards expanded. Luxury surrounded everyday life increasingly. Expensive cars, tailored clothing, massive houses filled with polished silence after events ended, and yet the quieter moments often remained remarkably similar to the earlier years. A fighter alone after midnight, thinking, recovering, listening to silence settle around the edges of a life built largely around noise. The body remained central through all of it. No amount of fame removes physical consequence from combat sports. Hands still swell after impact. Knees still ache after training camps. Sleep still becomes difficult after adrenaline-heavy nights. Recovery remains slow and private regardless of wealth or recognition. Perhaps fighters understand time differently because of this. The body constantly reminds them that careers remain temporary no matter how large the spotlight becomes, and temporary things often create urgency. Maybe that urgency partly fueled the intensity audiences sensed around him during those years. The feeling that every appearance carried deliberate force behind it. Every interview, every entrance, every prediction, as though he understood instinctively that moments at the top of public attention never remain permanent for anyone. Sports history moves quickly, crowds move quickly too. The same audiences chanting a person's name one year may already be searching for the next spectacle not long afterward. Fighters know this even if nobody says it aloud directly. The spotlight feels enormous while standing inside it, but eventually it shifts elsewhere. Perhaps that realization makes silence feel more honest than applause sometimes. Because silence asks for nothing, it simply remains. Late at night, long after arenas emptied and camera crews packed equipment away into trucks outside, the real atmosphere of a fighter's life often returned quietly. Ice packs melting beside beds, muscles aching beneath exhaustion, city lights glowing through enormous windows while the body slowly descended from adrenaline towards stillness again. And in those quieter hours, removed from the roar of crowds and the mythology built around him publicly, the man himself remained awake somewhere beneath the performance, listening perhaps to the strange distance between who the world believed he was and who he still felt himself becoming privately in the dark. There are certain injuries that change more than the body. At first, fighters usually experience pain as part of routine life. Bruised ribs, swollen knuckles, cuts above the eyes requiring stitches beneath bright medical lights after long nights inside cages. Damage becomes ordinary through repetition. Recovery becomes scheduled into existence almost like another form of training itself. But eventually, for many athletes, a different kind of stillness arrives. Forced stillness. And forced stillness can feel unfamiliar to people who built their entire identity through movement. For Conor McGregor, the years of constant momentum had created a life that rarely paused completely. Training camps blurred into media tours, Fights expanded into business ventures. Success accelerated daily routines into something enormous and relentless. Even rest often carried purpose beneath it. Recovery for the next challenge, preparation for the next spotlight. Then suddenly, the body demanded silence. Not metaphorical silence, real silence. Hospital rooms carry a very particular atmosphere after major injuries. The lighting remains soft but clinical. Machines hum quietly near the walls. Hallways outside never fully sleep. Medical staff move through the night with practiced calm while the injured person lies still listening to the strange unfamiliarity of being unable to move normally anymore. The body becomes heavy in those moments, fragile. Even powerful athletes cannot negotiate with physical damage once it has fully arrived. And perhaps that reality feels especially unsettling for fighters whose entire careers depend so directly on physical trust in themselves. Movement is not merely part of their profession, it becomes identity, reflexes, timing, balance. Confidence itself often lives partially inside the body's reliability. An injury interrupts that relationship suddenly. The future changes shape overnight. There were long periods when recovery replaced combat entirely, crutches instead of footwork, rehabilitation exercises instead of sparring rounds, slow controlled movement replacing explosive motion. The rhythm of life narrowed into healing, and healing can feel painfully quiet, especially after years spent surrounded by noise and attention. Public life often struggles to understand recovery properly because recovery appears uneventful from the outside. There are no dramatic entrances, no roaring crowds, no bright lights announcing progress, only repetition, patience, tiny improvements measured privately over weeks and months while the world continues moving elsewhere. But those slower periods may reveal more about a person than victory ever does, because competition creates adrenaline, recovery creates reflection. Late at night during those months, enormous houses likely felt different than before, wider somehow. Stillness expanded through the rooms more noticeably once training routines disappeared temporarily. Gyms remained untouched for days at a time. Equipment sat quietly beneath dim lights. Heavy bags hung motionless in corners where movement had once filled entire afternoons. The absence itself became visible. Perhaps that was one of the strangest parts. Athletes often define time physically. Training schedules organize days. Recovery sessions structure mornings. Sparring determines emotional rhythm. Remove those systems suddenly, and silence begins occupying spaces previously filled by routine. And silence can invite difficult thoughts. Not dramatic thoughts necessarily, more subtle ones. Questions about time, questions about longevity, questions about who someone becomes when the body temporarily refuses to cooperate with the image the world expects from them. The public version of Conor McGregor had always seemed untouchably energetic. Sharp movements, sharp words, a sense of momentum surrounding nearly every appearance. Seeing that momentum interrupted forced audiences into a different relationship with him suddenly. Not invincible, human. And human vulnerability changes the emotional atmosphere around fame. Perhaps privately it changed things even more. Recovery often isolates people because healing itself happens mostly alone. Doctors assist, trainers assist, family remains nearby. But pain becomes deeply personal after enough hours pass. So does uncertainty. Long nights awake while discomfort moves through the body. Watching time stretch slowly through rooms where movement once felt effortless. The world outside continued loudly meanwhile. Social media conversations never stopped. Headlines kept moving. New fighters emerged. Sports narratives shifted constantly toward whatever happened next. Fame rarely pauses sympathetically while someone heals. Attention drifts quickly toward fresh stories. Maybe that contrast deepened the silence further. A person recovering privately while millions continue discussing them publicly from a distance. During rehabilitation, ordinary movements often regain emotional significance, standing comfortably again, walking without hesitation, regaining balance. The body's simplest abilities stop feeling automatic once injury temporarily removes them. Even athletes accustomed to discipline can feel humbled by the slow mechanics of healing. And healing rarely moves in straight lines. Some days progress feels visible. Other days the body seems unwilling to respond at all. Patience becomes unavoidable then. Perhaps patience was always difficult for someone built around momentum and ambition. Fighters spend years learning to impose their will physically against resistance. Training rewards aggression toward limitation. Competition rewards forward movement. Recovery asks for the opposite sometimes. Stillness, acceptance, time. These are harder opponents in certain ways because they cannot be rushed. There were likely evenings during those quieter years when the atmosphere inside the house shifted into something almost reflective. Sitting near large windows while rain touched the glass outside. Watching distant headlights move slowly beyond the property. The gym downstairs remaining dark for another night. The body healing gradually while the mind wandered through older memories. Dublin streets, small gyms, cold mornings before sunrise. The younger version of himself still running toward ambition without fully understanding where it would eventually lead. Injury often reconnects people to earlier versions of themselves because physical vulnerability strips away illusion temporarily. Fame matters less when movement hurts. Public image matters less during long rehabilitation sessions repeated quietly day after day. Reality becomes simpler again. Pain, healing, waiting. And perhaps somewhere inside those slower months existed moments of unexpected clarity too. Because movement can distract people from themselves. Noise can distract people from themselves. Constant ambition can postpone certain questions indefinitely. Stillness does not postpone anything. It waits patiently in silence until a person notices it fully. The body eventually heals in most cases, or heals enough, but something often changes afterward regardless. Athletes begin understanding physical time differently once serious injuries enter the story. The illusion of endless momentum weakens slightly. Mortality becomes more visible beneath confidence. Even extraordinary discipline cannot completely protect the body from wear forever. Combat sports make this truth impossible to ignore eventually. Every fighter carries damage forward invisibly over time, joints stiffening quietly, reflexes slowing subtly, recovery taking longer than before. The public usually notices only dramatic moments, knockouts, defeats, visible injuries. But the deeper reality often unfolds privately across ordinary mornings when the body no longer responds with the same effortless speed it once did. And perhaps that awareness creates a quieter relationship with life over time, not softer exactly, more observant. Late at night now, the enormous mansion sometimes seemed less like a symbol of arrival, and more like a place suspended between different chapters of existence. Luxury surrounded everything externally, yet certain rooms still carried the atmosphere of unfinished thought. A private gym waiting silently downstairs, hallways dim beneath soft lighting, expensive watches resting motionless beside hand wraps on polished surfaces. The contrast itself felt revealing somehow. Violence and stillness existing side by side, fame and isolation existing side by side, a fighter's body healing quietly inside rooms built from extraordinary success. And outside the windows, the world continued imagining him mostly through noise. Interviews, headlines, predictions, controversies, victories, while the quieter truth of recovery unfolded slowly away from public view. Perhaps that hidden distance between public image and private reality had always existed. Injury simply illuminated it more clearly. Because eventually every athlete confronts moments when movement slows enough for reflection to catch up. The crowd's voice fades temporarily into the background. Training stops. The body rests unwillingly. And somewhere within that unfamiliar silence, a person begins listening more carefully to what remains, when performance itself becomes impossible for a while. Beyond the cages and cameras, another version of life had slowly begun taking shape. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, almost quietly beneath the noise of global attention. The world still saw Conor McGregor primarily through combat, through sharp predictions, bright lights, press conferences vibrating with tension. Yet away from arenas, ordinary moments had begun filling the spaces between those public images. Morning light entering large kitchens before the house fully woke, children's voices moving through hallways, televisions playing softly somewhere in distant rooms while coffee cooled untouched beside windows. These scenes rarely appeared in headlines, but perhaps they mattered more over time than many of the louder moments the public remembered most clearly. Fame creates a strange distortion around human beings. Audiences often freeze celebrities permanently inside the role that first captured public imagination. Fighters remain fighters, musicians remain musicians, actors remain characters people once loved on screen years earlier. But real life continues moving underneath those fixed perceptions quietly and constantly. People age, families grow, priorities shift in subtle ways almost invisible from the outside. And somewhere beneath the mythology surrounding him publicly, ordinary domestic rhythms had begun reshaping parts of his life too. The atmosphere inside the house changed depending on the hour. During afternoons, movement filled the rooms differently than during the isolated nights that often followed training or travel. Natural light spread across polished floors, conversations echoed softly through open spaces. Security remained nearby, somewhere beyond visibility. But inside the home itself there were moments when celebrity seemed temporarily less important than routine. A child running through a hallway does not care about pay-per-view numbers. Family life interrupts performance naturally. Perhaps that interruption became grounding in ways difficult to explain publicly. Because public identity, when sustained long enough, can begin hardening around a person like armor. Interviews require consistency. Media expects familiarity. Fans expect continuation of the personality they recognize. Over years, maintaining a globally recognizable image can become psychologically exhausting, even for those highly skilled at it. Home sometimes becomes the only place where performance loosens completely, or nearly completely. There were likely evenings when the atmosphere softened after the outside world finally quieted. Expensive suits folded away, phones temporarily ignored, television screens reflecting muted light into darkened rooms, while conversations drifted towards smaller ordinary things untouched by fame. The weather, travel schedules, family routines, children growing older almost too quickly. These quieter realities exist beside celebrity constantly, though audiences rarely think about them deeply. The public often imagines famous lives as uninterrupted spectacle, but most human existence still unfolds through ordinary details regardless of wealth or recognition. Dinner tables, late-night conversations, tired mornings, watching rain against windows while the house slowly settles into sleep. Perhaps those ordinary moments became increasingly valuable, precisely because so much of public life felt exaggerated. Arenas intensified everything. Social media intensified everything. Interviews intensified everything. Even success itself often arrived in overwhelming forms. Enormous crowds, endless attention, financial extremes difficult for most people to imagine. The nervous system cannot remain elevated forever without consequence. Eventually people search for quieter forms of reality again, and family life offers a different rhythm entirely than combat sports. Fighting depends upon dominance, confrontation, precision under pressure. Domestic life depends upon presence, patience, consistency, emotional availability during ordinary hours that carry no audience at all. These worlds do not naturally resemble one another, yet somehow they must coexist inside the same person. Perhaps that tension created moments of unusual stillness late at night, after everyone else had gone to sleep. Walking slowly through quiet rooms while the house rested around him. Looking at framed photographs scattered across shelves and walls, family moments beside championship moments, private memories beside public history. The contrast itself probably felt strange sometimes, One image capturing a fighter beneath blinding arena lights, another capturing an ordinary afternoon beside family somewhere far from cameras, both real, yet emotionally worlds apart. The larger the public persona became, the more valuable private authenticity likely felt. Because fame attracts constant attention, but not always genuine connection. Entire industries form around celebrity. Business relationships expand. Public friendships emerge beneath visibility. Crowds gather automatically. But real closeness remains rare regardless of status. Maybe that realization deepened over time, especially during quieter periods away from active competition. Travel had once dominated enormous portions of life. Airports, hotels, media appearances, training camps in unfamiliar cities where days blurred together through preparation and obligation. Athletes often live inside temporary spaces for years without fully noticing how disconnected that rhythm can become from ordinary grounded existence. Luxury softens discomfort, but it does not fully remove loneliness. A private jet still lands eventually. A hotel suite still becomes quiet after midnight. A fighter still sits alone with thought once the cameras leave. And perhaps that solitude felt more noticeable after returning home from long stretches inside public attention. Walking back into familiar rooms where fame mattered less than presence itself. Hearing ordinary sounds again. Doors opening softly, distant laughter. Footsteps across floors during early mornings before the day fully began. These moments rarely generate headlines, but they may slowly reshape identity more deeply than public victories. Because competition eventually ends for every athlete. The body changes, the spotlight shifts, the audience evolves toward newer stories. What remains afterward often depends upon the quieter parts of life built alongside fame rather than within it. Perhaps somewhere inside him, that awareness had already begun growing gradually through the years, not dramatically, more like a subtle shift in emotional gravity. The external world still demanded spectacle, confidence, performance, but privately, other forms of meaning may have started feeling equally important. Stillness after chaos, family after isolation, ordinary moments after public intensity. At night, the mansion itself sometimes seemed to hold both realities simultaneously. One wing carrying traces of combat and ambition, training equipment, recovery rooms, memorabilia from enormous victories. Another carrying softer evidence of domestic life. Toys left temporarily near furniture, family photographs beneath warm lighting, kitchens still faintly alive with a memory of conversation after dinner. Success had expanded life enormously, but perhaps it had also fragmented it. Different versions of the same person existing across different rooms. The fighter, the celebrity, the businessman, the father, the man alone after midnight listening to silence move gently through the house. And silence always reveals contrasts more clearly. During daytime hours, movement hides many things. Schedules distract, attention fragments, awareness. But late at night, once the noise fades enough, people often notice the emotional architecture of their lives differently. Large empty rooms feel larger, old memories return more easily, questions drift upward from quieter parts of the mind. Questions not necessarily seeking answers, only recognition. Perhaps that was why the later hours carried such unusual atmosphere around him now. Not sadness exactly, not regret. Something more reflective than either. The sense of a person gradually observing his own life from a slight distance, after years spent moving too quickly to fully process it. The younger fighter from Dublin had once imagined success almost entirely through ambition. Money, recognition, victory, escape from uncertainty. And much of that vision had arrived beyond anything the younger version of himself could likely have imagined realistically. Yet human beings rarely remain emotionally unchanged after reaching the destinations they once believed would complete them entirely. New questions emerge quietly afterward, not because success fails, because people continue evolving beyond the moment success first arrives. Outside the windows now, rain moved softly through darkness again. The city beyond remained distant and quiet beneath the night sky. Inside the house, most lights had already dimmed automatically. Somewhere down a long hallway, framed championship photographs reflected faint silver light against the walls. But the house no longer felt defined entirely by those images. There were other sounds now, other rhythms, other forms of meaning existing quietly beneath the public story the world still preferred to see. And perhaps somewhere inside that quieter domestic world, beyond the noise of fame and fighting, he had begun discovering parts of himself that could never fully exist beneath arena lights at all. Luxury changes the sound of a life. Not only visually, though, the visual changes arrive first and most obviously. The cars become quieter, the rooms become larger. Windows stretch higher toward the ceilings, while polished stone reflects soft evening light across enormous empty spaces. Private entrances replace crowded hallways. Security teams stand discreetly near elevators in hotels where entire floors remain inaccessible to ordinary guests. But the deeper change often happens in silence itself, because wealth creates distance, and distance changes the emotional atmosphere around ordinary experience. For Conor McGregor, success had eventually expanded beyond anything resembling the world he once knew in Dublin. The younger fighter, who travelled through rainy streets towards small gyms, now moved through environments designed almost entirely around privacy, exclusivity and control. Mansions hidden behind gates, yachts drifting slowly through dark water beneath foreign coastlines, tailored suits resting inside carefully lit dressing rooms before public appearances. The world often imagines these things as permanent fulfillment, and perhaps sometimes they are, briefly. But luxury can also become strangely quiet after enough repetition, especially at night. There were evenings when entire rooms remained untouched for hours at a time. Long hallways illuminated softly without footsteps crossing them. Large windows overlooking distant city lights, while rain traced slow patterns against the glass. Expensive furniture arranged perfectly inside spaces almost too orderly to feel fully lived in. Silence behaves differently in enormous houses. It expands. A smaller apartment gathers sound naturally, neighbours moving nearby, pipes shifting, softly inside walls, footsteps from the street rising upward through thin windows. But wealth often removes those ordinary textures. Space absorbs noise, distance absorbs noise. Eventually even footsteps begin sounding temporary inside rooms built larger than necessity requires. Perhaps that silence sometimes felt earned, and perhaps sometimes it felt unfamiliar. The body remembers earlier environments longer than people expect. Cold mornings in Dublin, small kitchens, training gyms crowded with movement and noise, buses carrying tired workers through rain before sunrise. Those memories do not disappear simply because the external shape of life changes dramatically. They remain somewhere beneath the surface, surfacing unexpectedly during quiet moments when attention softens enough for memory to move freely again. Maybe that was why nights carried such particular emotional weight now. The performance finally stopped after dark. The phones quieted eventually. The meetings ended. The cameras disappeared. Luxury remained surrounding everything physically, yet the emotional atmosphere underneath became far less certain once the noise faded away. A person can own extraordinary things and still sit awake listening to silence thoughtfully, perhaps especially then. Because ambition often organizes the earlier years of life with unusual clarity. Survival creates direction. Goals create momentum. The future remains visible ahead like a distant shoreline pulling someone constantly forward through exhaustion and uncertainty. But what happens after arrival? That question rarely receives public attention, because society prefers stories about ascent rather than adaptation. Audiences celebrate the climb towards success. They understand struggle. They understand victory. But the quieter emotional reality afterward remains more difficult to explain, especially when someone appears to possess everything externally. For fighters, this complexity may deepen further because competition itself creates addictive intensity. The nervous system becomes accustomed to enormous emotional peaks. Stadium noise, anticipation, physical danger, triumph, pressure. Ordinary life afterward can sometimes feel strangely muted by comparison. Perhaps luxury amplified that contrast rather than removing it. A yacht floating peacefully beneath moonlight still lacks the electricity of walking toward a cage while thousands of people scream your name into darkness. Expensive rooms still become quiet eventually. Private celebrations still end. The body still settles back into ordinary human awareness after adrenaline fades, and ordinary awareness can feel surprisingly lonely after years spent surrounded by spectacle. Late at night, the mansion often seems suspended between accomplishment and emptiness simultaneously. Not empty in a tragic sense, more like spaciousness carrying too much silence inside it. One room containing championship memorabilia beneath carefully angled lighting, another containing expensive artwork selected partly because wealth eventually requires visible symbols of itself. Yet objects rarely speak back to people, no matter how valuable they become. Perhaps that was why older memories sometimes returned more vividly during these quieter years. The body reaching backward toward environments that felt emotionally direct and uncomplicated. Smaller places, simpler routines, times when ambition still mattered more than maintenance of success itself. Because maintaining success creates its own form of pressure. Businesses expand, public expectations harden, reputation becomes fragile in ways invisible from the outside. The world no longer asks whether someone can rise. It asks whether they can remain at the top indefinitely, and nothing in human life remains indefinite. Maybe fighters understand this more clearly than most people, because physical performance declines visibly over time. The body changes gradually beneath the spotlight while audiences continue expecting the same explosive certainty they first fell in love with years earlier. Recovery slows, movement alters subtly. The mirror itself begins telling quieter truths each season. No amount of money fully interrupts time, and perhaps luxury makes awareness of time sharper in certain ways, because external comfort removes many distractions. Ordinary people spend their lives managing constantly. Once survival pressure disappears, other forms of reflection become more difficult to avoid. Questions about meaning, questions about identity, questions about what remains emotionally real beneath layers of fame and performance. These thoughts often arrive late at night. The world outside the mansion still imagined Conor McGregor primarily through spectacle. Sharp suits, confident interviews, enormous wealth, headline-making moments moving rapidly across screens worldwide. But private reality likely felt slower and more complicated than the public image allowed. Because public image compresses human beings into recognizable symbols: the fighter, the celebrity, the wealthy man, the controversial figure, the champion. But symbols cannot capture ordinary loneliness, or fatigue, or reflection after midnight while walking slowly through silent rooms larger than entire buildings from earlier life. Perhaps that was why certain quieter rituals remained important despite luxury surrounding everything now. Training alone early in the morning, sitting near windows watching weather move across the sky, driving late at night when roads emptied enough for temporary anonymity. These moments restored contact with something more grounded beneath the layers of attention and expectation. Silence itself became almost protective. Not empty silence, private silence, the kind that allows a person to exist briefly without performance. And performance had followed him for so many years by then that the absence of it probably felt unusual at first. Fame conditions people into awareness constantly. Someone is always watching, recording, interpreting, waiting for reaction. Even stillness becomes content eventually. But true stillness resists observation. It exists quietly away from audiences. Perhaps some nights he wandered through the house unable to sleep fully, moving past reminders of success resting silently in glass cases and framed photographs. Championship belts beneath soft lighting, magazine covers, watches worth more than entire apartments from his earlier years in Ireland. The younger version of himself would once have looked at these objects with disbelief. The older version perhaps saw something more complicated in them now. Achievement certainly, but also time passing. Years compressed into material evidence scattered across rooms that grew increasingly silent after midnight. Outside, rain continued touching the windows softly. The city beyond remained distant beneath darkness. Somewhere downstairs, the private gym waited untouched again for another night, heavy bags hanging motionless in shadows while expensive recovery equipment reflected faint light across polished floors. The contrast lingered everywhere. Violence and luxury, noise and isolation, victory and stillness. And somewhere within that enormous, carefully constructed world, the man himself continued moving quietly through the silence. No longer only the ambitious fighter from Dublin, no longer only the global spectacle audiences recognised, but someone existing uneasily between those identities now, listening perhaps for something quieter than fame had ever allowed him to hear before. There comes a point in many famous lives when the public image begins arriving before the person does. Doors open differently. Conversations shift instantly. Entire rooms reorganize themselves around expectation before a single word is spoken. For years, Conor McGregor had existed inside that atmosphere almost constantly. Hotels prepared for him before arrival. Security cleared pathways through crowds already waiting. Cameras adjusted toward entrances before he even stepped into view. The world had learned the shape of his presence, or at least the version of it visible publicly. But identity becomes more complicated after enough years spent performing one version of yourself for millions of people, especially when that version grows larger than ordinary life itself. There were nights when the house felt less like a home, and more like a place holding different eras of the same person simultaneously. One room carried evidence of early ambition, framed photographs from smaller fights, older training gear, reminders of a younger man still climbing toward recognition. Another room reflected extraordinary success, tailored luxury, polished design, championship history preserved carefully beneath soft lighting. Walking through those spaces late at night probably felt almost like moving through memory physically. Different versions of himself waiting quietly behind different doors. The younger fighter from Dublin, the rising star hungry for global attention, the celebrity surrounded by spectacle, the father listening to distant sounds of family life elsewhere in the house, and somewhere beneath all of them, perhaps someone harder to define clearly than any public label allowed. Because identity rarely remains stable under constant visibility. The world prefers consistency from famous people. Audiences become attached to recognizable personalities. They want the same confidence, the same energy, the same sharpness that first captured attention years earlier. Public expectation slowly hardens around celebrities until deviation itself begins feeling disruptive. But human beings continue changing privately, whether audiences allow for it or not. Perhaps that tension deepened during quieter years away from constant competition. The pauses between fights grew longer, recovery periods stretched wider, reflection entered spaces previously occupied entirely by preparation and momentum. Silence gained more room to exist, and silence changes self-perception gradually. The younger version of Conor McGregor had once defined himself largely through movement towards something. Success remained ahead. Recognition remained ahead. Financial freedom remained ahead. The future pulled him forward constantly through struggle and exhaustion. But eventually the future arrived, or at least a version of it did. What happens afterward can feel strangely disorienting, because ambition organizes identity powerfully while a person is still climbing. Goals create direction, obstacles create clarity. Every sacrifice appears connected to something visible ahead. But after extraordinary success arrives, life often loses that simple structure. New forms of uncertainty emerge quietly beneath achievement. Questions without obvious opponents. Questions without timelines. Questions impossible to answer through aggression or discipline alone. Who are you when the noise fades? What remains when performance pauses? Can a public identity ever fully contain a private human life? These questions rarely appear directly in words. They appear atmospherically instead. Late-night restlessness. Long walks through silent rooms. Moments staring out windows while the city glows distantly below. Perhaps fame itself intensifies these feelings because celebrity separates people from ordinary reflection in subtle ways. Public figures spend years reacting outward constantly. Interviews, appearances, expectations, scrutiny. Attention pulls awareness toward external performance almost continuously. Stillness reverses that movement. Stillness turns awareness inward again. and inward attention can feel unfamiliar after years spent living publicly. There were likely nights when sleep remained distant despite exhaustion, the body tired, the mind still moving, television screens dark beside enormous windows while rain drifted softly through darkness outside. Somewhere downstairs, the private gym resting untouched again. Somewhere online, millions of strangers still discussing fragments of his public life, without understanding the quieter reality unfolding beyond visibility. Fame creates strange duplication. The public version of someone continues existing independently, even while the private person changes internally. Perhaps that separation sometimes felt exhausting now. Not because success itself lacked value. Success had transformed everything materially. It had changed family history, created freedom, built an extraordinary life far beyond earlier uncertainty in Dublin. Those realities remained real, but success does not stop human complexity. If anything, it often exposes deeper layers of it. The body itself may have contributed to this growing reflection too. Fighters experience time physically. Every training camp reveals small changes. Recovery speed shifts subtly. Injuries accumulate quietly beneath public appearances. The mirror begins showing traces of years spent inside violence and pressure. Not dramatic decline necessarily, just evidence. The evidence of time moving forward whether someone wishes it to or not. And perhaps few things sharpen awareness of identity more than realizing the body cannot remain exactly what it once was forever. Combat sports force this recognition eventually. Every fighter understands, somewhere privately, that there will come a final walk toward the cage someday, a final training camp, a final introduction beneath bright arena lights. The public rarely likes discussing endings while stars still remain visible, but athletes themselves often feel those realities approaching long before audiences notice clearly. Maybe that awareness created unusual emotional distance around fame over time. The spectacle remained enormous externally, yet internally some quieter part of him may already have been standing slightly outside it, observing rather than fully belonging to it anymore. Observation changes atmosphere. A person begins noticing details differently. The emptiness after celebrations, the silence inside luxury, the strange fragility beneath public mythology. Late at night, the mansion often seemed almost too quiet for someone whose life had generated so much noise globally. Entire hallways remained motionless beneath dim lights. Expensive watches reflected silver light from distant windows. Framed moments of triumph rested silently against walls without the roar of crowds surrounding them anymore. Memory itself became quieter inside those rooms, and quiet memory can feel heavier than public excitement sometimes. Perhaps he occasionally looked at older photographs and recognized not only success, but distance. The younger man, staring confidently toward the future from those images, could not yet fully imagine the emotional complexity waiting beyond achievement itself. Ambition simplifies life. After ambition succeeds, complexity returns. The world still wanted the familiar figure. Sharp, fearless, larger than ordinary life. But privately, identity may have softened into something more reflective over time. Not weaker, not less confident. Just more aware of contradiction. A fighter capable of violence yet craving silence. A global celebrity searching occasionally for anonymity. A wealthy man still emotionally connected to rainy Dublin mornings from years earlier. A public figure carrying private exhaustion, invisibly through rooms filled with luxury. Human beings rarely become singular things completely. Fame merely encourages the illusion that they do. Outside the windows now, the rain had nearly stopped again. The city beyond remained distant and dim beneath the night sky. Inside the house, automatic lights glowed softly along empty hallways, while the atmosphere settled deeper into stillness. And somewhere within that silence, beyond the public persona repeated endlessly across screens worldwide, a quieter version of Conor McGregor continued existing privately. Not performing, not predicting outcomes, not commanding attention, but simply moving through the uncertain space between who he once imagined becoming and who he now found himself to be when nobody else remained awake to watch. The years after the highest peaks often move differently. Not slower exactly. Life still remains full. Meetings, training sessions, travel, responsibilities stretching across business and family and public attention. But the emotional texture changes. The sharp upward momentum that once defined every season gradually softens into something less obvious, more reflective. The future no longer feels like a distant mountain waiting to be climbed. Instead, it begins spreading outward in quieter directions. For Conor McGregor, the climb had once seemed endless. Every victory opened another door. Every headline expanded the scale of possibility. The world kept growing around him faster than most lives ever experience. But eventually even extraordinary momentum reaches calmer terrain. And calmness can feel unfamiliar after years spent living inside intensity. There were nights now when the atmosphere inside the house seemed almost suspended between accomplishment and memory. Trophy rooms resting silently behind glass. Hallways lined with moments that once shook entire arenas. Expensive artwork illuminated softly beneath carefully placed lighting, while rain moved faintly against distant windows outside. Nothing inside those rooms needed proving anymore. Perhaps that was the strangest part. For so many years, life had revolved around proving things. Proving talent, proving belief, proving confidence was justified rather than imagined. Every fight answered one question while immediately creating another. The cycle continued endlessly because competition itself depends upon renewal. A champion remains champion only until the next challenge arrives. But what happens when a person grows tired of endless proving? Not defeated, not broken, simply aware that constant escalation cannot continue forever. The public often struggles with this stage of famous lives because audiences prefer permanent intensity from the figures they admire most. They want endless hunger, endless confidence, endless spectacle. Yet human beings naturally evolve beyond singular emotional states over time, especially after living publicly for many years. The body itself had likely become quieter in certain ways now. Still powerful, still disciplined, but more aware of recovery, more aware of physical consequence. Fighters begin noticing the smaller negotiations required with age and experience, longer warm-ups, more careful management of injuries, greater attention to rest. The younger body once absorbed punishment almost recklessly. The older body remembers everything. Perhaps that memory changes a fighter's relationship with violence subtly over time. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. Recognition that every moment inside the cage carries accumulated cost eventually. Bruises fade, swelling disappears, but years leave traces deeper than appearance alone reveals, and perhaps silence reveals those traces most clearly. Late at night, after the world finally quieted, there were likely moments when memory moved through the house almost physically. Walking past framed championship photographs while recalling not only victory itself, but the exhaustion afterward, the adrenaline, the recovery, the strange emptiness that sometimes followed enormous public triumph. People imagine success as permanent emotional elevation, but most victories end quietly. A celebration fades, guests leave, lights dim, and eventually someone remains alone again listening to silence settle back across the room. Maybe that realization had become increasingly important over the years. The understanding that life itself happens mostly in quieter spaces rather than dramatic moments. Public memory compresses existence into highlights, but real human experience unfolds through ordinary hours between the highlights. Morning coffee before anyone else wakes, driving alone at night, watching weather move slowly across the sky from large windows, sitting quietly while the house breathes around you after midnight. These moments rarely appear in documentaries or headlines, yet they may shape identity more deeply than public spectacle ever does. Perhaps that was why reflection had begun entering the atmosphere around him more noticeably now. Not spoken directly, not announced, just present beneath the surface of quieter interviews, longer pauses, calmer evenings away from arenas. The younger Conor McGregor once seemed powered almost entirely by forward momentum. The energy was sharp, explosive, relentless. But time often rounds certain edges naturally. Experience complicates certainty. Success complicates ambition. Public attention complicates self-perception. And somewhere beneath all those complications, a person gradually begins asking different questions than before. Not, how far can I rise? But perhaps, what remains meaningful once I already have? Those questions cannot be answered through aggression, or confidence, or performance. They require stillness. And stillness had become more available now than during the earlier years of non-stop ascent. The world outside continued debating his legacy endlessly. Fans argued online. Commentators compared eras. Journalists speculated about futures, comebacks, endings. Public narratives surrounding famous athletes never truly stop moving because audiences dislike unresolved stories. But privately, life often feels far less dramatic than the narratives built around it. A man walking slowly through his own house at night does not feel like a headline. He feels human. Perhaps that humanity became easier to notice during quieter periods, away from active competition. Family routines grounding daily life again. Children growing older. Conversations shifting toward things untouched by fame or fighting. The nervous system gradually learning how to exist without constant anticipation of conflict, or trying to learn, because fighters rarely escape combat psychologically as easily as they leave the cage physically. Competition shapes awareness deeply, vigilance becomes instinctive, adrenaline becomes familiar, intensity becomes emotionally normal. Ordinary calm can almost feel unnatural afterward. Maybe that was why the later hours carried such strange emotional atmosphere now. The silence itself seemed to ask for adjustment, for patience, for acceptance of a slower rhythm than the one that built the earlier years of his life. Outside the windows, the city remained distant and mostly asleep. Rainwater reflected scattered lights along quiet roads below. Somewhere downstairs, the private gym waited in darkness again, equipment arranged carefully, heavy bags hanging motionless, reminders of a life built largely through physical discipline and confrontation. But upstairs, another kind of life had slowly expanded around the edges of all that ambition. Domestic life, reflective life, a quieter relationship with time itself. Perhaps that quieter relationship had begun reshaping his understanding of success too, not rejecting wealth or fame, but seeing them more clearly as external conditions rather than permanent emotional destinations. Luxury solved many problems. Recognition changed everything materially. Yet neither fully replaced the simpler forms of meaning people eventually return toward naturally. Presence, connection, peace during ordinary moments, the ability to sit quietly without needing noise constantly surrounding you. These things become valuable in different ways after years spent inside spectacle. And perhaps somewhere inside the stillness of these later years, beyond the headlines and mythology and endless public conversation, Conor McGregor had begun understanding something the younger ambitious fighter from Dublin could never fully grasp while chasing success so fiercely, that a human life cannot survive entirely as performance forever. Eventually the lights dim, eventually the crowd quiets, eventually a person must sit alone with themselves in the silence afterward, and decide whether anything real still exists there once applause has disappeared into memory. Tonight, the house seemed almost built from that silence. Soft lights glowing against polished floors, rain fading slowly outside, championship photographs resting motionless in the dark. And somewhere within it all, a man moving quietly through the enormous stillness of his own life, no longer running toward the future quite so urgently, but listening instead to what remained once the noise of becoming had finally begun to fade. Near the end of the night, silence begins changing shape. The earlier hours still carry traces of the day, distant traffic, muted movement somewhere beyond the windows, the lingering energy of unfinished conversations and glowing screens. But after enough time passes, another atmosphere arrives. The world slows almost completely, roads empty, lights disappear floor by floor across distant buildings. Even large houses seemed to exhale quietly into darkness, and inside that stillness, certain thoughts become easier to hear. The mansion rested almost motionless now. Soft light remained beneath the staircase. A hallway stretched silently toward darkened rooms where framed memories watched from the walls without movement. Somewhere downstairs, the private gym still waited in shadow, untouched tonight again. Heavy bags hanging still, gloves resting neatly beside benches, recovery equipment glowing faintly beneath dim electronic lights. Everything felt paused, not abandoned, just resting. Perhaps that was the closest atmosphere to peace a life built around combat could ever fully know. For years, Conor McGregor had existed inside motion. Physical motion, emotional motion, public motion. Entire seasons of life accelerated beneath pressure and ambition, until ordinary stillness almost disappeared entirely beneath the momentum of becoming someone larger than the life he first emerged from. And he had succeeded. There was no uncertainty about that anymore. The young fighter from Dublin who once rode through cold mornings towards small gyms had crossed impossible distances. Wealth arrived, recognition arrived, the world learned his name, entire arenas once shook with anticipation before he even stepped into view. Millions of people watched fragments of his life unfold through screens glowing across continents. The noise became global. But noise never lasts forever. Eventually every crowd goes home. Every interview ends. Every camera powers down. And what remains afterward is often quieter than anyone imagines while chasing success for the first time. Perhaps that quiet had slowly become familiar now. Not empty silence. Earned silence. The kind that settles around people after long periods of struggle, performance, conflict and transformation. A silence carrying memory inside it. Memory of crowded arenas, hotel rooms after victories, injuries healed slowly through difficult months, rain against windows in Dublin years earlier before fame changed the architecture of everyday life completely. All of it still existed somewhere inside him simultaneously. Human beings never fully become only one version of themselves. The younger ambitious fighter remained there. The global celebrity remained there. The father, the businessman, the exhausted athlete sitting awake long after midnight because the nervous system still remembered years of adrenaline and anticipation. Different identities layered quietly together across time. Perhaps wisdom, if it exists at all, arrives when someone stops trying to separate those identities completely and simply allows them to coexist. Because no single role fully contains a person forever. The public version of Conor McGregor would always remain sharp in collective memory. Confidence delivered like certainty itself, movement beneath bright lights, press conferences alive with tension and spectacle. Audiences preserve famous people through simplified images because simplicity feels easier to hold on to emotionally. But private reality had always been slower than that. More reflective, more uncertain, more human. Late at night, none of the public mythology mattered much inside the silence of the house. Championship belts resting behind glass did not speak. Luxury watches resting on polished counters did not erase memory. Expensive rooms did not prevent reflection from arriving quietly once the world finally fell asleep outside. Perhaps that was why the quieter moments ultimately felt more truthful than the louder ones. Not because the spectacle was false, the spectacle had been real too. The crowds were real. The victories were real. The ambition was real. But spectacle compresses human experience into moments of intensity, while real life unfolds mostly through quieter hours hidden between them. A fighter sitting alone after midnight, a father walking silently through darkened rooms while the house sleeps, a man staring through glass windows toward distant city lights wondering how quickly entire years disappeared. These moments rarely become headlines, yet they often carry the deepest emotional weight. Outside, rain had stopped completely now. The city beyond the windows rested beneath thin clouds and scattered silver light. Somewhere far away, an occasional car moved through empty roads, its sound fading almost immediately into the distance again. Inside the house, Stillness deepened further. The younger version of himself once imagined success almost entirely through escape. Escape from uncertainty, financial pressure, limitation. And success had indeed transformed everything materially. Entire generations of his family would live differently because of what he built through discipline, confidence, and relentless ambition. That mattered. It would always matter. But perhaps life itself had quietly revealed another truth over the years too. That achievement changes circumstances more easily than it changes the deeper questions people carry inside themselves. Questions about identity. Questions about peace. Questions about what remains meaningful once the loudest goals have already been reached. These questions do not disappear through wealth or fame. If anything, they become clearer once external struggle quiets enough for reflection to surface fully. Maybe that was what the silence had been offering him all along. Not answers, just space. Space to observe his own life without the distortion of performance surrounding every moment. Space to remember the ordinary human being beneath the public image. Space to recognize that beneath all the spectacle and ambition and noise, he had always simply been a person trying to build meaning from the particular life he was given. Like everyone else, only beneath brighter lights. The house remained quiet. Somewhere near the windows, faint moonlight rested across the floor in pale shapes. A championship photograph reflected softly against the wall nearby. One frozen moment of triumph captured permanently in time while the real person inside the house continued aging quietly beyond the frame. Time always moves forward eventually. Even legends continue waking into ordinary mornings. Perhaps there was something strangely comforting in that realization. Not tragic. Human. The world would continue speaking loudly about Conor McGregor for many years. Fans would debate his legacy. Old fight footage would continue replaying endlessly online. New fighters would emerge while commentators compared generations and moments across history. But tonight, none of that noise existed here. Only silence. Only the soft architecture of a life finally at rest for a few brief hours. And somewhere within that stillness, beyond the fame and violence and mythology built around him over so many years, the quieter truth remained. A man shaped by ambition, transformed by success, softened by time, and left alone at the end of the night with the same thing every human being eventually returns to after the world stops watching. The sound of their own thoughts moving gently through the dark,